All right, you guys, we are going to try this again because it looks like the Facebook Live one that I did earlier really messed up. So I'm going to go through this again. What we were talking about is the Garden of Gethsemane or the Mount of Olives, the prayer at the Mount of Olives, like it says in Luke, or Matthew calls it the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. I like to call it the temptation in the garden. And you'll see by the end of this, hopefully you'll see why I say this. And what I want to do is kind of rethink a common understanding that we have of this and kind of explain why I think, and some other people that I've learned it from, have thought that this is probably the reason for it. Okay, so this is my dog Glock in the background, so you'll see her there, so just ignore her. I'm going to try to. My ADD doesn't have much. But okay, we're going to start by reading the passages that we're going to be talking about. Luke 22, verses 39 through 46. It says, and he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, which is the base of the Garden of Gethsemane, if anybody hasn't been there. And the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Now, the other version of this one is in Matthew, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see it. All right. I think you guys can see that now. No, I think I went to the wrong one. Okay. Let's see, share screen. All right, hang on one second. Let me get this right. Okay, this should show the screen here. In Matthew in 26, Jesus prays in Gethsemane. Then Jesus went to them a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And talking with Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So remember that one part where it says, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. That's how he begins the prayer. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went and prayed. And he said, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And he again came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the words again. And then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand. Okay. So let me get back to talking through this. Okay, so what we see in the first hand, and normally when we think of this, when we hear this in most teachings, it talks about Jesus, and in his flesh, he was thinking about the cup when he says, take this cup from me. And this is the big question. What does he mean by the cup? But when he says, take this cup from me, what is he referring to? Now, I remember years back in the late 80s is when I was, David Hawking was the teacher. I was at Calvary Temple Bible College. And David Hawking was doing a class, and he was talking about this topic. And what he said has stuck with me to this day, 20-some years later. Basically, some things he pointed out was, one thing, he says, take this cup from me. The second thing is, we don't know what that cup was because nothing in there says what it is. So it's an assumption on most part to say that he was thinking about the cross coming ahead. And because of that, he's thinking about the cup, that he refers to that as a cup. But the reality is, a cup biblically is a portion. It's whatever God gives you. Now, Psalm 23, a cup is a good thing. So it can be anything. It doesn't necessarily mean some cup of suffering. It can be a cup that overflows, where it says, Lord, my cup flows over. So all throughout the scripture, the cup is just whatever God has designated for us. It's our portion. And that's, literally it holds our portion. This is my cup, and I drink of my cup. So when he says, take this cup from me, nevertheless, not my will be yours, but yours be done, there's some interesting theological problems with that. So the first one has to do with him saying, not my will, but yours. Okay? That's the first one we're going to talk about. Not my will, but yours. That has to do with his divinity and his humanity, because it raises a lot of question about how human was he and what does it mean to be essentially human? Because normally we think he is the perfect example of humanity without the sinful nature. He's the second Adam, without the sinful nature, but perfect. So there can't be anything that's contrary to God in that nature. It has to be perfectly aligned with God's will at all times. So it raises some questions. I mean, I'm not saying they're insurmountable by no means, but it raises some serious questions about, is it possible for us to be aligned with God's will, yet desire to not do something that he wants us to do? Because obviously the cross was revealed. Jesus knew from the beginning, and he had his head set towards Jerusalem, it says. He says, set his head toward, like flint toward Jerusalem, to go to the cross, because he said, this is the whole purpose I'm here, is to go and suffer and die for the sins of the world, but I will resurrect. So this is his purpose from the beginning. So he already knew this. So to say, I don't want to go, is to say, part of me doesn't want to do the will of the Father. There's something in me he doesn't. So if that's human nature, that raises some serious objections, some serious problems theologically on, did he have the potential to sin? I'm not going to go into all that, but it raises some heavy theological points. Also, it raises a point, is it possible that now we're talking about a 50-50, where his humanity doesn't want to do it, but his divinity obviously would. So there's no way him in his divinity would say, I don't want to do the will of the Father. His divinity would want to do the will. And even in perfect humanity, I have a problem with thinking that Jesus didn't want to, that his will was not going to. Now he could say, my flesh doesn't want to, but to him say, not my will. He doesn't say, not the will of my flesh, because that would kind of symbolize sinful humanity. So not my will be done. So how do we reconcile those things? And it's a difficult problem to tackle. So what I want to offer to you is an alternative way to look at this text, another way to understand this that seems to fit the scripture better. So the first thing has to do with the cup. Now, Hawking pointed out that it says present tense, take this cup from me. It doesn't say take that cup from me, or this cup coming. It says take this cup from me. Now, what could he be referring to besides the cross? Well, whatever he's suffering. He says, my soul is sorrowful, even to death. And he says that before he says, take this cup from me. He just says, sit here while I go over and pray. Then he says, my soul is sorrowful, even to death. Now that phrase means, I am dying from this. Literally means, my soul is very sorrowful, and it's going to kill me, or it's at the point of death. Okay, literally dying. He says, so remain here and watch with me. So he falls on his knees and prays, and he said, Father, if this possible, let this cup pass from me. So the context would seem that he's talking about his soul being sorrowful. Not so much whatever it's sorrowful about. Now, he could be hypothetically saying, in this future thing, I'm thinking of take this cup from me, this thing that I'm focused on. But it could very well be, and the context seems to point towards, let this cup pass from me. There's my sorrow that I'm dying from. And that would make sense because he knows he has to go to the cross. So he's saying, don't let me die here. Now, that brings the question of, unless this cup pass, I will drink it, your will be done. Okay, if this cannot pass, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So if he says that, and that's the second in verse 39, Matthew 26:39, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So normally we'd be saying, okay, but if obviously you want me to go to the cross, but I don't want to go, but I'm going to do what you want. That raises some application points. It means, okay, so when we don't want to do something, we should do it anyways because God said to, right? Now, that raises some problems even with something as simple as tithing, because Paul says, be a cheerful giver. And if you don't desire it, God doesn't want it. God doesn't need when he says, I desire mercy and justice, not your sacrifices. Your sacrifices are like nothing to me. They're an abomination to me, is what God says to Israel many, many times. He says, these things that I've commanded you to do, don't do them just because I said so. You got to get the point behind it. So it raises some other problems there to interpret that saying the cross. But if we're saying, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not what I'm asking, but whatever your will is, now that doesn't have any theological problems, because he could very well be saying, I know you want me to go to the cross, and I know this is the reason I'm came, and I'm asking you, don't let me die here, but if you're going to let me die here, now this could be like an image of Abraham with his son, who had the same issue, who was told that his son would be the father of many nations, but then God said, kill your son. And Abraham said, and it tells us in Hebrews, that he was willing to do it, knowing that God could raise him from the dead and still fulfill the promise. So this would fit that parallel of Abraham, where he's saying, if I'm to die here, I trust that you'll resurrect me. So take this cup from me, but if you have something you haven't told me, I'm okay with that. Now that's going to have some great application later on. We'll talk about that again, but in the 5 points that I have that we pull from this. So it's very possible he's saying, don't let me die here, but if you're going to let me die here, I'm okay with that. So now it raises some other questions with things Jesus said that seem to fit the second scenario better. Jesus said, whatever I ask the Father, he gives me, because I always do the things that please him. Now, that's either kind of a hyperbole or a metaphor, or it's literal. If he says, everything I ask the Father, he gives me, okay? When he says, take this cup from me, that would seem to imply that that would have been the end of the conversation. The Father would have said, okay, you're not going to go to the cross. And that also fits when Jesus says that all authority has been given to me to lay down my life or take it up. That's been given to me by the Father. It's my choice, not his. He's given me that decision to where I lay it down willingly or not. And so he says, it would make sense for him to say, I want to go to the cross. It doesn't make sense for him to say that I don't want to go to the cross, but I'm going to do what you tell me anyways. Even though I've been given the authority, if he had been given the authority, then it would seem to me that when he says, I don't want to go, that would be the end of the discussion. He wouldn't even have the rest of his prayer. It would have been, okay, then you don't want to go, then you're not going. Okay? But he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. But it also, to me, it just makes less complicated, the whole topic. If he's saying, I'm going to go to the cross, I want to go to the cross, but if you're going to let me die here, I trust that you're still going to work out your plan. Because there might have been something you haven't told me, and that's not sin to not know something. What is sin is to say, I don't want to do something that you've told me you want me to do. That would border on sin. And that's the problem with the first interpretation. It's bordering, for me, my understanding of what sin would and the dynamics of sin, and maybe there's a way around it, but I think it's very, very complicated to try and explain how Jesus would say, I don't want to do what the Father has revealed for me to do because of my humanity and my flesh and all these things that I didn't want to do it, but I did it anyways. And I'm submitting to the Father's will, not my will. Even in his humanity, could he ever be divided from the will of the Father? Could Jesus ever desire something that he knew the Father did not want, that the Father did want him to do? Okay? Could he desire to not do something? Could he just say, I don't want to go to the cross, even though you've told me this is your will, I don't want to do it. Okay, that's borderline. So let's take the other way of looking at it. That, okay, let's say Jesus is saying, okay, I want to go to the cross, but if I die here, you know what? I trust you to resurrect me or do whatever's in your plan. That's a great message and a great encouragement from us. So back in Luke, it also says an angel came and ministered to him. And that's important because the angel was likely the answer to his prayer. And that fits if Jesus says, whatever I ask the Father, he gives me. Boom. He gets an angel and it comes and minister to him. And Luke, being a doctor, actually uses a medical term. And when he says ministers to him, it literally is the word that's used for healing. It's a medical term. So it's physically, medically ministering to a sickness. So for Luke to use that phrase could be metaphorically because it's a doctor and he used that, but let's say it's physical. Let's say it is anxiety. Now, the great drops of blood, this is the point that I also want to make. is when he says, I'm sorrowful even unto death. Now it tells us in Luke, in the passage in Luke that we were looking at, it literally says he started dripping great drops of blood. Now, what we know that is medically, it's a condition where you have so great of anxiety and sorrow and depression that, and this is a huge point for those who suffer from depression, if it's chemical, if it's medical, if it's emotional, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. If it's a choice, that's different. But if it's the other thing, it's not sin to suffer depression. It's sin to stay in it and wallow in it and choose not to get out of it. And when you know how to, okay? The other thing is if it's chemical, that's not sin either. If it's chemical, that's just a physical illness, okay? So if it's even mental in that side, that's not a lack of trust in God, okay? Now, to dwell on that and you choose not to respond to it, that's different. Jesus does the appropriate thing. As soon as there's the anxiety, he immediately prays and has somebody pray for him and goes to the Father and takes it to him. Now, when it says he ministers, it's interesting that the condition is anxiety, where the drops of blood are capillaries that have burst on the outside of your skin. And once that happens in ancient time, it means you're bleeding to death because there's no way to fix that. They didn't have blood coagulants. They didn't know about how to coagulate the blood in that sense, in that way, to where they could actually stop somebody from doing this. And I forget the name of the condition. I should have looked it up first, but I'll post it on there later on. But it's literally, you're bleeding to death. And that would make sense when he says, I'm sorrowful even unto death. That's how Matthew reconciles with Luke, where I'm sorrowful even unto death. Why? Because I am so anxious that my capillaries are burst and literally blood is starting to ooze out my pores because the capillaries are burst and they have no way to coagulate. So I'm bleeding to death. And so he says to the Father, take this cup from me. Don't let me die here. But if this is your plan, I'm okay with that. But my will is to go to the cross and live and get through this. And when the angel came and ministered to him, that could have been the angel, it says, and strengthened him and giving his body the ministry and the healing part so that it begins to heal and it begins to close up the capillaries. And it says he dropped, great drops of blood came out after that point, and then obviously it stopped. So that could be the answer to his prayer, and that would fit the context much better than the angel came and ministered, gave him strength to go on. Well, that I could say that would kind of fit the same on both just the angel ministering. But it's interesting, Luke talks about medical. Luke uses that term for medicine, and so for that reason it does seem to fit better that it's a physical condition that Jesus is asking for healing from. And it's also interesting to note that this is the only place that we know of, if this is true, where it literally says he took our infirmities. In every other way he was tempted in every way like us. This would be the only example we have that he actually got a physical illness and was healed from it, and he showed us how to respond through it. And he didn't succumb to that temptation either. So he knows what it's like to be physically ill to the point that you're dying from it. Okay? So then we get to the last part. So he went away, prayed for the third time, and then it says, sleep, take your rest, for the hour is at hand, and then his betrayer comes. Now that, to me, also is an indicator, this is probably what he was sorrowful about. Judas was one of the 12. He had lived with them. He loved him greatly, like the rest of the apostles for 12. It's very possible in this prayer that we have a scene in heaven, and this is just my speculation on this point, okay? But it's very possible, like he says to Peter, that Satan has desired to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you. I've interceded for you. This could have been that conversation about Judas, that this is the will that Judas was going to betray him. And that sorrow that he felt could have been over that. It could have been over the sins of the world. It could have been over the rejection by his own people. It could have been over a number of things. But whatever it is, it's interesting that it follows the context in both stories of his betrayal and his arrest. So, and it literally says he betrayed him with a kiss. Okay, so he could be knowing that that's coming and knowing that this is the end of Judas and being sorrowful over that and being so brokenhearted over that it cost him such great anxiety, interceding for him. But if Judas wouldn't have it, then there's nothing you can do. So having said that, we have two possible interpretations and we have two possible ways we can apply it. Now, if we apply it the traditional way, that Jesus was saying, I don't want to go to the cross, then the application is, even if you don't want to do it, do it. If you know it's God's will, just do it. Doesn't matter whether you want to or not, just do it. Ask God for strength to be able to do it and go get the job done. And that's a true statement. Like I said, there's some questions on that one. Should we give even when we don't want to? God loves a cheerful giver. Does he want us to do it just out of duty and obligation? Maybe, maybe not, but that's an arguable point, okay? So, but these are the interpretation you get from it. But if we take the other side of this, okay, and when you're struggling with that, when you don't want to do something, do it, have people intercede for you, these applications would still apply. But I think these applications fit much better if we say that when you come to a situation where you know God's will, expect opposition. That's point number one. Expect opposition. Expect the enemy, your flesh, the flesh of others, the weakness of others, the weakness of the flesh, also spiritual attacks, also enemies of the gospel. These are our enemies in the world. These are the enemies of the gospel. These are the enemies of the kingdom. And we should expect opposition, especially when we're getting close to the goal. We should expect that. That's point number one. The second thing is have others pray for you. Okay? Don't try and go through it alone. Have others pray for you. But also, you need to pray. You need to spend some time with the Lord. That's point number three. You need to go to the Lord and ask him to intercede for you. Ask him to do whatever's necessary. Okay? Point number four is ask him to do whatever's necessary. That was three. Point number four would be that always plan on doing God's will, but be flexible on how God is going to do it. Okay? So always be flexible in doing God's will. Okay? Be set on doing it, but flexible on how to do it. Right? So I kind of messed that up. So let me re-say that. Okay? Always be committed to doing God's will. Whatever he tells you to do, do it, but always remain flexible. Allow God to be God and sovereign over how he's going to accomplish that. And this is what we see in this passage where he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. Okay? If you want to do it in a way you haven't revealed to me, I trust you that you're still going to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Okay? So those are the points that I want to pull from it. And I think if we look at those two ways of doing it, number one, ox and razor, it's a simpler understanding because there's less theological problems with him saying, don't let me die here, but I want to go. But, you know, if you're going to let me die here, I trust you. But if you don't, I'm okay with that too. But my request is this, that fits what he said. Everything I asked the Father he gives me, he got it. He received the healing. He was able to go towards the cross. He also says, I always desire to do the things while the Father says. Everything I ask the Father is because I always please him. I always do the things that please him. This is pleasing. It also gives a great model to us when we hit that opposition and we're struggling down the finish line, especially when we're finishing up a major thing that God has set for us. But expect opposition all along the way and have others pray for it. Don't pray for you. Don't do it alone. All right. So hopefully this answers some questions for you guys and maybe gives you a different way to think about the passage. If you have any comments, questions, or problems with this interpretation, by all means, post below here and I will comment back. All right. God bless you guys. I love you guys. Bye.